Great. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar series hosted by the Animal Welfare Slack workspace. My name is Jen Chu. I'm currently a research scientist at Prairie Swine Center. So, on behalf of Christian Nawars, Laura Salazar, and Sebastian Gumo, we really thank you for joining us today. And today we're really happy to have Dr. Mahi Points as our speaker. So Mahi is an agronomist by training with a master's degree in animal productions. Her early research focused on cattle feeding behavior in relation to pasture characteristics. She then turned her attention to equine welfare, studying social interactions and resting patterns in horses. She completed her PhD in 2024 at the University of Bern in agroscope in collaboration with Agroscope, where she investigated the effects of feeding dispensers on horse health and behavior. During her doctorate, she also supervised several studies on equine behavior, cognition, and sleep patterns. Her work centers on animal behavior and welfare, particularly in horses and cattle, with research interests ranging from feeding and social behavior to medical training and sleep. She has a strong interest in combining ecological observations with sensor-based data, such as GPS and accelerometers, to better understand how animals interact with their environment. Currently a visiting scientist at Agroscope, where she is finalizing and publishing the results of her PhD while seeking postdoctoral opportunities. She aims to bridge scientific research and practical application, providing meaningful insights into equine welfare and supporting horse owners and professionals in their decision making. So before we start, can I just kindly ask the audience to make sure that your camera is turned off and then your microphone is also turned off, just in case that we have, a better and smoother webinar when Mahi is talking. So Mahi's talk, the title of her talk today is Horses and Slow Feeders Investigating Consequences on Horse Health and Behavior. So Mahi, really welcome you here, and then please go ahead. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. I am really happy to be online with you today so I can present you what I did during my PhD. So as Jen just said, I did my PhD at the University of Bern in collaboration with Agroscope. And as you may have guessed, it was focusing on horses. So a quick overview of this presentation. I will start with a little bit of background, and then I will go all of the chapter of my thesis, and I will end with a general discussion. So first, a little bit of background. Don't worry, you don't need to be very familiar with horses for this talk, but all you need to know is that our domestic horses, they have very specific physiological and behavioral needs because they have evolved to have a diet that is high in fiber. So they actually need to spend a lot of time feeding without long feeding breaks, and they also need a sufficient number of mastication. And if these needs are not being fulfilled, well, we can have some issues such as abnormal and stereotypic behavior, increased aggressiveness, but also some digestive problems. And what's quite striking is that actually these physiological and behavioral needs of our domestic horses, they are very similar to that of the wild or feral horses. So it seems that their needs have not evolved so much. However, what has evolved are their nutritional needs, because obviously most of our domestic horses are kept in captivity, so they are more or less provided with everything they need. And also most horses, they are used only for recreational purpose only, so they have limited energy expenditure. And also during the domestication process, humans have involuntarily selected some genes that make some horses more susceptible to overweight. So it's really, so lots of horses are actually have too much energy, and so this can lead to overweight or metabolic disease. And overweight is a very serious condition for the equine population. It is known to affect a large part of it, and it is associated with many adverse health outcomes, a reduced lifespan, and also a compromised quality of life. So that's why lots of equine experts really call this thing like the feeling dilemma of the equine industry, because it seems that the physiological and behavioral needs of horses don't match their nutritional needs anymore. Of course, there are some solutions. I will not really go into detail, but during my thesis, I was especially interested in the two last ones, so having a better portioning of the daily intake over the course of the day, or trying to slow down the ingestion. And slowing down the ingestion is exactly the aim of the so-called slow feeding dispensers, so the focus of my PhD. Slow feeding dispenser are dispensers that mechanically slow down the ingestion. So as you can see on the picture, there is like a great diversity of slow feeders, but they all have in common that they really make the horse work to access the hay. So it theoretically takes longer to the horse to ingest the hay. These slow feeders, so depending on the survey and depending on the country, we know that they are being used by 30 to 70% of the owners, at least 5 or 6 years ago, and now we even think they are becoming even more popular. So they are really used by a lot of horses and a lot of people. So when I started this PhD, there were already lots of things that we knew on slow feeding dispensers. So lots of studies have focused on their efficiency to increase the intake time. We also knew that they are efficient to enhance the welfare for stabled horses. Some study also found that they modifying the feeding behavior and the posture while feeding compared to loose hay. And some study also suggested that they may be associated with some muscular tension. And there was also one pilot study that suggested that horses may be actually willing to feed from the slow feeders dispenser, even though they have access to free hay. However, there were still lots of questions to be answered. So, for example, we were missing very basic knowledge about slow feeding users, like who are they, why are they using slow feeder, what's their feedback. We also did not know how much slow feeder modifies the feeding behavior, and especially compared to the natural feeding behavior of horses, so when they are grazing on pasture. We had no clue about the long-term effect on the muscular tension. And all the study, or most of them, focused on stabled horses and only a very specific type of slow feeder that are suspended nets. I will show you a picture afterwards. And the horse's preference was still to be assessed. So during my PhD, we aimed at answering kind of all these questions. So my PhD was divided in several chapters, and here it's just like an overview so you can see the different questions we had and also the kind of study we use for each question. The hypothesis we had from the existing literature was that slow feeder could improve the horse-human relationship and promote a more natural feeding behavior, especially compared to loose hay. However, it could be associated with some health impairments. And when comparing the slow feeding with the multiple portioning, so the other feeding strategy I mentioned in the introduction, we thought that slow feeding would promote a more natural time budget, but that it could be frustrating to horses because the horse really has to work to access the hay. Okay, so for the first chapter, we were interested in the population of slow feeding users, and the aim were really to first have a better knowledge of the target population, so people and horses using slow feeders, and we really wanted to describe this population because it had not been done so far. And obviously, the second question was also to identify the key areas for research so that we would ensure that my PhD would be really valuable for the equine industry. So we designed an online questionnaire and we distributed the questionnaire online. And in total, we got almost 1,300 answers, so mainly from France, Belgium, and Switzerland. And so today I will not present you all the findings because it's basically a very long and maybe a bit boring description of slow feeding practices, but I will represent you the most important finding for my PhD. And actually the first finding we got was that even though I presented you with like a very large diversity of slow feeding system, we could see that most of our respondents were using hay nets. So we decided to focus this PhD on hay nets. And it also showed us that we should not only investigate the suspended nets that had been investigated so far, so these kind of nets that we can just put in stable for horses, but also different type of nets, and especially what we call the covering nets. So it's basically a net that is covering the hay, because they were actually the most common one. And this was even more important that our findings suggested that the type of net may influence several factors. Also, we found that slow feeding was a relatively new practice, and that most horses that were being fed with a slow feeder were only being fed using a slow feeder, so they did not have any access to other loose hay or other roughage. And finally, the last finding was that the horses that were feeding from nets seemed to differ from the general equine population. So according to the description of their owners, they were a bit older, they were trained a bit less, and they were also housed and fed in a more welfare-oriented way, I would say. So the conclusion we drew from this study was that yes, we needed further research for several reasons, which was a good news because I was going to work for like 4 years on this topic, but also that we should be very careful when sampling, especially for observational study, because our target and therefore study population, so horses using slow feeder, are different from the equine population. So we had to be careful if we did not want our sample to be biased. So this was the first chapter, and in the second chapter, we were interested in the feeding patterns and their consequences on horse behavior and posture. So just so you know, feeding behavior and equine health are really linked because forage collection and mastication are linked to the dental wear, and the dental wear is essential for horses for their dental health. Also, I told you in the introduction that the mastication is important, and it's because it promotes the saliva production, which has a buffering effect for the digestive tract of horses, so it's really important to them. And also, we know that horses spend a lot of time feeding, so obviously the posture they have while feeding may be of interest in the long-term perspective. And finally, for decades now, we have identified the importance of choice for animal welfare, so it seems also important to present the horse with something that it likes, if we can. However, until now, all the studies that investigated feeding behavior with slow feeders, they only investigated the forage mastication and not really the forage collection. And they always compared it to loose hay only. So the aims of this second study was to compare the feeding behavior and posture between hay in hay nets and loose hay, but also to compare it to the natural grazing behavior of horses. And we also wanted to evaluate the preference of horses regarding hay presentation. The hypothesis we had was that the prehension and mastication rates will differ between hay in net and loose hay, but we thought that presenting hay in hay net would promote a more natural prehension and mastication, although it could increase the frequency of neck torsion. And for the preference part, we thought that when given the choice, horses would preferentially feed from loose hay, but not exclusively, because that's what had been suggested in a pilot study. So before starting this experiment, we did a pilot study with the usual aim of a pilot study, I guess. And to do so, we had 4 stallions that were presented with 4 different feeding treatments. So loose hay on the floor and 3 different types of slow feeder of different height and material. And we were recording the feeding behavior of the horses while they were feeding. For the ethogram, we were, as I said, we were especially interested in the prehension, so the collection of the forage. And in horses, it's kind of divided in 2 steps. First, the horse is gathering the forage using the upper lip. And then once the forage is attracted, the horse will use his incisors to really bite and tear the forage. We were also interested in the mastication, so the chewing cycles. And for the posture, we were especially interested in the neck torsion because it has been reported in previous studies that some horses may display some neck torsion while feeding from hay nets. So from this pilot study, besides the sample size we needed and so on, we also had a result that suggested that the forage prehension is really different between loose hay and all different kinds of slow feeders. And that really made us wonder, okay, it seems to be different, but which one is the most natural one for horses? So that's when we decided to include 4th treatment in the main study with the pasture. A 3rd treatment, sorry. So for the main study, we had 12 horses in 2 different groups, and they were using different type of hay nets. And so they were recorded while feeding from loose hay, hay in hay nets, and different height of grass. So yeah, we recorded several videos for the feeding behavior using the same ethogram. And as I said, we were also interested in the preference test. Unfortunately, we could only use 5 of our 12 horses, but these 5 horses were exposed to 3 tests of 30 minutes, where they were presented with 2 with hay in net and loose hay simultaneously. And we were basically just looking at the time spent feeding from net, loose hay, or not feeding. So the result we had first regarding the feeding behavior and the posture. So the first thing is that we had it confirmed our preliminary result, because we could see that despite the fact that horses were feeding from the same forage or hay, we had significant differences between loose hay and hay in net for all the behavior we were looking at. So this is how a horse feeding from loose hay looks like. So as you can see, the horse is mainly using the upper lip to collect the forage, and it's kind of chewing and collecting the forage in a continuous process. Whereas here with hay net, you can really see the horse is biting, and then it will start using a bit the upper lip and chewing at the same time, and then back to biting and so on. So it looks very different. And if we look at really like a 1-minute video and we look at the rates of the different behavior, so sorry, in blue and yellow, you will have the forage collection, and in brownish, you will have the chewing thing. And so this is with hay net. So as we saw, it's the horse is gathering with the upper lips and biting several times, and then will chew and so on. And with loose hay, as you can see, it's completely different. So everything is different. And remember, the question was also, but how does it look like when a horse is just grazing on pasture? So this is with short grass, medium grass, and high grass. So first, I think you can clearly see that we really had an impact of the height of the grass. But if you look at the forage collection, so once again, the yellow boot and the blue bar, we could really see that the forage collection with hay net did not differ significantly from the one from the pasture, because in every case, every cases, the horses were using a bit the upper lip, so that's the yellow feeding boot, and then biting several times and so on. Whereas with the loose hay, you can see that we have almost no use of the incisor. So the horse is using exclusively the upper lip to collect the forage. And for the chewing rate, so the brownish bar, they all differed significantly, but the one we observed with hay net was kind of in between the short and medium grass, whereas the chewing rate with loose hay was even higher than with high grass. For the posture now, we looked at how much time a horse spent with like a twisted neck over the whole feeding time. And I think you can clearly see that we only observe neck torsion with loose hay and hay net. So it was really clear, and it was even clearer that we had a significantly more neck torsion with the net. So the blue box plot. But what we found was also that the frequency and the duration of the neck torsion were influenced by the inclination of the net. Because remember, I told you that the horses were using different type of nets. And the first one, I don't know if you really see it well on the picture, but the net is kind of vertical. And for the two other feeding dispenser, the net is really horizontal. And you can really see, and we could really see an impact on the frequency and the duration of the neck torsion. For the preference test, as expected, the horses fed predominantly from loose hay, so the green color. But some horses were also feeding from hay net. And what you cannot see here, because this is the pooling of the free test, is that we actually had a very high intra-individual differences, because, for example, the CH horse, there was one test where it exclusively fed from the hay net. So it was really dependent on the test and on the horse also. So in conclusion, in this study, we did validate some of our hypotheses, but not really all of them. And the takeaway from this study were that providing hay net instead of loose promoted a more natural collection of forage, which could be of interest for the dental health. However, we observed a reduced number of chews with the hay net, which could be concerning, but yeah, over the course of the day, it is actually compensated by the fact that horses need more time to ingest the hay with a hay net. But we did observe an increased frequency of neck torsion with net, and especially vertical net, which really raises the question of the muscular impairments on the long-term perspective. And for the preference test, we did have a limited sample size and we could not perform anything else than descriptive statistics, but our results were in line with the literature. And it may seem appealing that horses are willing to feed from hay net when they have like free hay available, but this behavior has already been described. It's called contra-free loading, and it has already been observed in other herbivores, so it may well be that horses also display this kind of behavior. Okay, I hope you're still with me. So now the third chapter about the long-term effect, because yes, we knew that slow feeding had some positive effects on the equine health and welfare because it increases the time spent feeding. It also decreases the frequency of repetitive and abnormal behavior. And we also just saw that it promotes a more natural feeding behavior. But there were still lots of concern among the researcher or even the horse caretakers. And obviously, the first one is about the posture the horse display when they are feeding with hay nets. And it's not only about the neck torsion I just showed you before, but it's also, there was, for example, a team of Italian researchers that found that horses feeding from hay nets actually have a different shape of the back and a different neck head angle. And yeah, this could be a concern, and this could be associated with some muscular tension. On this topic, the results were conflictory when I started this PhD, but still, some study found that there was an effect of the hay net, and some did not. But yeah. There was also the question about the effect on the oral cavity, so the gums and the teeth of the horses, but also their vibrissae, so the whisker of horses, because horses are rubbing their mouth against the hay net all day long, so that could be an issue. And there was also the question about the horse-human relationship, because one study had found a positive correlation between use of slow feeders and horse-human relationship, but yeah, it was only a correlation. So the aim of this study was to look at the association between the use of hay nets and all the things I just listed. But we really wanted to investigate the mid and long-term consequences, because most of the studies so far really implemented slow feeding for like few weeks and then they assessed the horses, so it was really short-term. The hypothesis we had was that the use of hay net would be associated with an improved horse-human relationship, but also maybe with some gingiva impairments and also an increased vibrissae wear. We did not think it would be associated with any specific dental wear, as it's sometimes mentioned in like some Facebook group or whatever, because hay nets are kind of soft compared to some slow feeders that are made from metal or plastic. But we still thought that it could be associated with some musculoskeletal impairment, especially in the neck region or on the back line of horses. However, when I started to plan this experiment, I ran into some methodological issues, because for the reactivity to humans, no problem. There were already several tests that were described and validated in the literature. But for the oral cavity, there was one protocol that was very well described, but had not been validated yet. And for the musculoskeletal health, it was really worse, because there were only few studies. It seemed that all of them were using different methodologies, but they were not really giving any details. So it was really hard to try to replicate the findings. So that's where we decided to add another study to test the protocol of the oral cavity and also to design a new protocol for the musculoskeletal health and to test it. And so how did we test it? Well, we looked at the criteria for a good protocol, and a good protocol should give accurate measure, but it should also be consistent over time and give the same result even when it's performed by different assessors. So we decided to check the inter and intra-rater reliability using some published guidelines. And because we had to assess a lot of horses, you will see afterwards, but we also were interested in the feasibility part. So this was, yeah, the fourth chapter of my thesis. It has not been published yet, but yeah, we published it as a preprint. And so for the protocol that we use, so for the oral cavities, I told you there was one protocol that was very well described, and it's based on photograph assessment. So basically you just open the mouth of the horse and you take a picture, and then you analyze it on the laptop. And there are 6 items that are being scored, from 1, meaning everything is fine, to 3, meaning there is an issue. For the musculoskeletal health, we designed a new protocol, and it was relying on a live evaluation of some muscles, some joints that we selected because they could be of interest for the slow feeding posture, but also because it could be relevant for the overall horse health. And the assessor was giving score from 0, meaning healthy, to 3, meaning a major disorder. So I decided not to present you all the detailed result because it's basically like lots of table about with GWET and kappa indices. But yeah, to summarize, we had a moderate to high inter and intra-rater reliability. We also found that both protocols were quick and easy to perform, but we also found that training was really important, and even more than background sometimes. So we concluded that provided that the assessor had prior training, these 2 protocols were non or minimally invasive and reliable ways to assess horse health. So we could now use them quite with some confidence for the 3rd or 4th study. And obviously, we would have loved to go for an experimental study. But as I told you before, we were really interested in the mid and long-term perspective. So it would have been quite tricky to plan such an experimental study. So we decided to go for a cross-sectional study so we could compare horses feeding from nets for a long time and horses not feeding from nets. And before we started this study, we conducted another pilot study on 25 horses. And we were looking at the feeding management of these horses and assessing the musculoskeletal health, oral cavity, vibrissae, and reactivity to humans, as we just mentioned. And the result we got from this pilot study was that first, the largest sample size that we needed to have was for the musculoskeletal health, and it told us that we should investigate at least 670 horses. And most importantly, we also identified that there was a potential source of bias, so different factors that could influence our response variable, whether it was the musculoskeletal health or the vibrissae or whatever. And these factors, I don't know if you remember, but there were also some of them the factors for which we found the horses using slow feeder to be different from the general population. So that's where we decided to go for stratified sampling to ensure that our 2 groups would have comparable proportion. Once again, I did not included all the details here, but yeah, if you want more details, I have slides that are ready. So finally, in the main study, we were able to investigate 702 horses. So 352 horses were feeding from a net. So they were the net horses, and 350 horses were feeding either from loose hay or hay that was presented in another dispenser that was not a slow feeder. So they were the control horses. And so just so you have an idea of how it went, so we started with the 2U reactivity to human test. So the first one was performed when the horse was free in its environment, and I was basically looking at the response the horse was displaying when I was approaching. Then we would have the second reactivity to human test once the horse was tied with a second human. Then my colleague would start the evaluation of the musculoskeletal health. Then we would evaluate the body condition score of the horse. Then we would take the photo for the oral cavity score, so the protocol I just mentioned earlier, and we would end with the live evaluation of the vibrissae length and the gum coloration. And of course, we are also collecting information about the feeding management and the general information of each horse. The key finding of this study, for the reactivity to human, we did not have any clear differences between the two groups. There were some tendencies, but it was only tendencies. Although we were investigating like 700 horses. So yeah, even if there was something, it was a really, really small effect size. For the musculoskeletal health, we first looked at the total MSH score to have like an overview of the health of the musculoskeletal health of the horse. So remember, 0 meant healthy, so the smaller the score, the better the musculoskeletal health of the horse. And I think we can quite clearly see that there was no significant difference between the two groups. They were very similar. A big variability, but yeah, very similar. And even for specific areas, such as the back lines, the neck, or everything, yeah, everything was very, very similar between the two groups, so we did not have any significant differences. For the oral cavity, kind of the same. We did not find any association between the use of HayNet and the vibrissae length, or most of the oral cavity parameters, such as the cracks, the teeth abrasion, and so on. However, we did find that using HayNet was a risk factor for redden and raised gingival margin, which could be indicative of an edema. And how does it look like? Like a redden and raised gingival margin. So the gingival margin is really like the thin kind of line of margin you can see on top of the teeth. And you can see on the right that we did have some horses that were displaying like a bulge. And this could be an issue because this gingival margin is supposed to act as a barrier against the microbe and so on. So this could be an issue, but that's the only thing we really see as a difference. So overall, as a conclusion, we had very reassuring result for the about the horse health. However, we did have some of our findings that were in contradiction with the existing literature, especially the reactivity to humans and the musculoskeletal health. So this could come from the experimental design, the methodology we use, but also maybe from our sample size that was much bigger than most of the study. Also, this study really highlighted the importance of the overall living condition of horses, because I did not show you, but we had an impact of, for example, the housing or the training frequency of horses on their musculoskeletal health. So this really highlighted that stratified sampling was essential, but it also means that we should be very careful with the generalization of our result to a different population, because it may well be that our results do not apply to, for example, old horses or horses that are being kept indoor for 23 hours a day and so on. And finally, obviously, this was only an observational study, so although it was conducted on 700 horses, we still need to confirm the results. Okay, last chapter, and then it's over. So the last chapter was about the impact of feeding strategy, especially for horses that were kept in groups. Because keeping horses in groups is also a big topic in the equine world, because we know that conspecific are super important to horses, and we also know the detrimental effects the single housing can have, which is why group housing is highly recommended. However, despite all of this knowledge, the individual housing is still very prevalent among horses. And this is mainly because of the fear of injuries, especially for horses that have an economical value. So our idea was that maybe slow feeding could be an alternative to make sure that we reduce the risk of injuries, but while still having an optimal body condition. And why is that? Is because we know the hay availability is closely linked to aggressiveness in horses, but as we discussed it in the introduction, we cannot give ad libitum hay to whole horses, mainly because of overweight or even waste. So the two potential feeding strategies I mentioned earlier, the multiple portioning or the slow feeding, could be really interesting in this point. So the aims of this study, the first one was to compare these two feeding strategies that have the same goal, kind of. So either ad libitum hay, but with a net, or having the daily feed that is divided in multiple meals over the course of the day. But also to test the importance of the hay availability versus the duration of the feeding break. So we really wanted to explore whether it was the total time spent feeding that was important, or if we all could already improve the welfare of horses by just reducing these feeding breaks. The hypothesis we had was that slow feeding would enhance the welfare because it would promote a more natural time budget and also reduce the aggression. However, it could cause frustration, and the multiple portioning strategy could improve the horse welfare compared to the traditional feeding strategy. So the method, we were especially interested in the social interaction, injuries, time budget, and laying behavior because it has been suggested as a recent welfare indicator in horses. For this study, we had 4 groups of 4 to 5 mares that were housed in a very similar, identical way. So I don't know if you already see it well, but in the background of the photo, you can see some red buildings. So those are the shelters. And in front, you can see the feeding area with the hay rack. And there are some tracks that are connecting the 2 areas. And horses were fed with a time control hay rack, so we did not have to bring the food every time. We had 3 treatments. So the first one was what we call traditional. It was our control. It was 3 feeding slots of 2 hours each. So it's kind of what horses usually get in most of the stable. And portions, so 6 feeding slots of 1 hour each. And it was really divided. It was really during the day and the night also. So for these 2 treatments, it was the same total hay availability, so 6 hours, and it was with loose hay. And the last treatment was slow feeding, so ad libitum hay, but the hay was covered by a net. We did a crossover design, and for each treatment, horses had 3 weeks of habituation, and then we would start collecting the data. So what data exactly did we collect it? So for the social interaction, we did 15 hours of live observation, and we were recording social interaction, but also noting the activity and the spatial positioning of the mares. We also recording the number of new injuries after 2 and 4 days. And we looked at the time spent lying using accelerometers. So key findings, first, regarding the diurnal time budget. So I think what you can clearly see first is that, it's not working. Okay, so it doesn't matter. With slow feeding, we had an increased feeding time. So this is the dark green, and also more social interaction and a bit less standing. So the light blue than in portion. Oh, sorry, it doesn't display, but the left column in is slow feeding, and then it's portion and traditional. Okay. Sorry for that. And okay. And for the traditional and portion treatment, we had because horses were having the same access time to hay. For the social interaction, the first thing we looked at were the affiliative interaction, such as playing, roaming, spending time together, and so on, but we did not find any effect of the treatment. And for the agonistic interaction, we especially looked at how horses behave during the feeding times, because that's usually where aggression may arise. And we could see that in the slow feeding treatment, so the green box plot, we had a significant decrease of the agonistic interaction we observed compared to the portion, so the blue treatment. However, contrary to our expectation, we did not find any significant differences between the portion and the traditional treatment. For the injuries now, we did not find any effect of the treatment on the injury incidence. However, we did observe that we had less body-located injuries in slow feeding, so on the left, than in the 2 other treatments. And usually it is said that body-located injuries result from direct aggression from conspecific, whereas injuries on the head or on the legs could result from, I don't know, a horse bumping into the hay rack or sliding and so on. And finally, for the lying behavior, I promise, I know this graph may seem complicated, but it's not, I promise. So basically for each group, each horizontal bar is the average of the time spent lying per day for the whole group. But you can see each horse is represented by a symbol. And I think you can clearly see that first we had very, very high inter, but also intra-individual variability. But yeah, in general, you can also see that the blue bar is usually the lowest, and sometimes it is very, very low with almost no lying behavior observed during the 2 weeks, because we had a significant reduction in time spent lying in the portion treatment. So in conclusion, in this study, we validated some of our hypotheses, but not all of them, and we even refuted one. And as a takeaway, I would say that the slow feeding treatment really had a positive effect on the welfare of horses compared to the multiple portioning, because we had less agonistic level, a more natural time budget, like a more normal lying behavior, I would say. So it seems that slow feeding is a valuable option to optimize the time spent feeding. We also, in our study, did not have any behavior indicative of frustration, as it is sometimes reported in other studies. So we did not have any horse that was biting the net or pawing at it or anything. But however, our agonistic level with ad libitum, so with the slow feeding treatment, was still a bit higher than what is usually reported with ad libitum loose hay. So it could still be an indicator of some frustration. Also, in contrary to our expectation, reducing the fasting period, so with the portion treatment, did not effectively reduce the level of aggressiveness and risk of injuries, and it even seemed to disturb the lying behavior of horses. So further research on the topic is really needed. Okay, so now a short general discussion and some perspective. So if we just remember the initial hypothesis through this work, so regarding the human-horse relationship, we did not find any clear association, but it may well be that slow feeding still improves the horse-human relationship for horses that are being rationed or that are kept indoors, because yeah, it helps fulfilling their needs. We also found that hay net promoted a more natural collection of the forage and an unchanged number of shoes. Regarding the health impairment for the oral cavity, we found that yes, hay nets were a risk factor for redden and raised gingiva margin, but not for an increased teeth or vibrissae wear. For the musculoskeletal health, we found that no, hay nets were not a risk factor for increased musculoskeletal health impairment. And for the comparison between slow feeding and multiple portioning, we found that yes, ad libitum hay net promoted a more natural time budget and a lower agonistic level than the portions feeding, so it seems to suit better horses that are kept in groups. And of course, this work also has some limitation, because we did lots of different type of study, but some of them were only observational. So for this study, we still need to confirm the result with some experimental study. We did have some sample size that were limited, so we need replication also. For the last study, unfortunately, we could not quantify the hay consumption, and we did not investigate all the other weight management strategies, so that would be interesting for a further study. And also, even though it was on purpose, this PhD only focused on hay nets. So yes, these results only apply to hay nets, and we don't know anything else for the other kind of slow feeders. And now I guess the question I often have when since I have finished this PhD is, would I recommend the use of slow feeding? And yeah, my answer is always, it depends, because I really think that there are lots of situations where slow feeding can be something good, but there are also some situations where I would maybe not recommend it. For example, for horses that are old, or horses that can already receive ad libitum hay without any risk or anything. And I would definitely avoid mobile, vertical, and high slow feeders for the neck torsion and everything. And yeah, as a conclusion, I think maybe the best way to see slow feeder is maybe to see them as an enrichment, because if we look at the definition of an enrichment, I think that through this work, we really demonstrated that yes, slow feeding is beneficial to the horse. It also increases the behavioral diversity, and it promotes some species appropriate repertoires. So maybe, yes, that's the best way to see it. And so it's interesting for the welfare of horses, but it should be, done with, we should be cautious. And now, obviously, this was not only my work, so I want to thank the Uniburn for their support and guidance for more than 4 years. Also, all the colleagues of Agroscope, also all the practitioners that work with me for the musculoskeletal health, and especially Clemence, who assessed with me the 700 horses. All the interns I had the privilege to supervise, the horses I could also assess, and their owners, and all my friends and family that supported me during this work. And now, if you have any question, I'd be happy to answer. And sorry, I was a bit too long.
No, thank you so much, Mahi. It's such a rich and then detailed presentation. I was like taking a lot of notes, and it's very interesting to see the really kind of ecological investigation of even how they use the different, the slow feeder and then how that compared to their normal in the natural, on pasture. So it's really interesting. I'm sure we already have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna just jump to the audience question first. If you have any question, please feel free to put in the chat, or if you would like to ask yourself, please also feel free to raise your hands, and then we will ask you to unmute yourself. So I think Chantal has an earlier question while you were actually talking about. I believe that was coming from chapter 2 when you were kind of comparing how they use the hay net. So they were
Yes.
asking, does the net have knot or the knot in it and the size? I guess it's the size of
Yeah.
the squares. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, they did not have knots. Actually, when we investigated in the second chapter, in the first chapter, all the horses that were using hay nets, we only see one horse that was receiving hay in a hay net with a knot. And yeah, I think it's almost not used anymore, except for like, in the trailer when horses are being transported or everything. But most of the time, people are using hay net without knots because I think they've heard that it's supposed to be damaging maybe the teeth, although there is like no scientific evidence for that. But it seems that people heard about this because yeah, we never saw any horse with only one with a hay net with a knot, and we did not use any hay nets with knots also.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And for the size of the openings,
Mm-hmm.
we used what is usually like the medium size, so it's 4 centimeter or
Yeah.
4.5 sometimes, but it's
Okay.
between 4 and 5. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Birte has a question. So she said that in chapter 4, so you
Yeah.
have the 3 by 2 hours and the 6 by 1 hour, slots. Were the horses on different treatments at the same time? If so, could they have affected each other, as some horses had access but not the neighbors and on the different treatments? So yeah,
No. Can I? Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Do
You
you
go
still
back.
see like my slides? Yes?
Yeah, yeah. Now we see the whole
Okay.
PowerPoint. Yes.
Yes, okay. So I don't know if you see it very well here, but the
Mhm.
groups were like close to each other, but they were really separated. I think
Okay.
here you can see the fences. And so horses were separated. So they may have been a bit influenced because sometimes the group next to them would have like the hair rack that would open and not theirs, but they could
Mhm.
not really get close to the other hair rack. So and that's also why we did this crossover design. So we had like a washout period and so on to prevent any rebound effect. But yeah, definitely we did have some horses, for example, when they were in the traditional treatment, they could see that in the other group, the hair rack was always open for the slow feeding, for example, treatment, but they could not get near to the hair rack.
Okay, thank you. And Katarina is asking, thank you. It was such a nice presentation. I especially love the design. Yes, I agree. And did I get it right that slow feeding decreased agonistic interactions? If so, why do you think it was the case? I would expect the opposite due to frustration. Thanks for the clarification.
Yes. So yes, we kind of maybe expected a little bit more of agonistic interaction due to frustration. And actually, there were some studies that found this result. But I think for us, this result really comes from the fact that in slow feeding treatment, horses could just feed every time they want, anytime they wanted. So they could really, I did not show it here, but I think I do have it somewhere here. No, maybe. Okay. Oh no, sorry. It's yeah. So if you look at the time budget, horses with in slow feeding treatment, they really spend a lot of time feeding, almost 70% of their time, which is actually what they are supposed to do. Whereas in the portion and traditional feeding, they could access the hay for only 6 hours. And I think that's where comes the really big frustration, because horses were really, when the hay rack would open, they would be very, very, yeah, very frustrated, because sometimes they did not have access to hay for like 6 hours, which is very long for horses. And I think that's where the agonistic level come from. And actually, we even looked at whether this agonistic level was the same during the whole feeding times. And we could see that it was, the horses were especially aggressive during the first 15 minutes. So because they kind of, okay, it's opening and now I need to access the food. Some horses that were dominated, they could not really access, and some dominant would be very aggressive and so on. So I think that's why we had lots of more agonistic level in the portion and traditional treatment.
If I can quickly follow, because Marie, you just
Yeah.
mentioned dominance. Did you look at dominance?
Yes.
How they? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Nice. So Stein has a question, very informative presentation, but he did a lot of work. Yes. Are there other indicators to assess frustration, or the other way around, to see whether horses are actually satisfied when given access to hay nets?
It's both signs of frustration. So we were expecting some signs that were being reported in other studies. So as I said, there were lots of studies where they reported that horses would like paw at the hay net or really bite and try to like fling it or anything. And we never observed that. And I think in our case, it really came from the fact that they had a lot of time to get habituated. So they had 3 weeks of habituation, which is not so much, but still a lot more than in most studies, where sometimes they have like 0 or 2 days to get used to it. And signs of, you said, what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Like how do we know whether they are actually satisfied? Satisfaction.
Satisfaction, unfortunately, yeah, it's hard to tell, because I think like for lots of animals, we are better at seeing like negative emotions and positive emotion in horses. And I think, so we did not look at it for sure. And all the study I have in mind, they looked at sign of frustration, such as, like backwards, ears, or the blinking rate or anything, but I do not have in mind any studies that looked at signs of, content, because I think for now we are a bit behind compared to negative emotions.
Yeah, more research needed, right? So
Yes, like
always something
always.
you can investigate. Yeah, the positive animal welfare side.
Yes.
And we have Kanaka Raja was asking what kind of, I guess this is probably related to the last chapter. What kind of hay feed materials you use to feed experimental horses?
So it's regular hay. I would say, unfortunately, we could not conduct any forage analysis, so we did not exactly know what was inside the hay, but we tried to keep it quite consistent, because it's quite tricky at the Swiss National Stud Farm, because there are so many horses. Usually they need like a lot of hay, so we are used to like change hay every 2 or 3 months. So the only thing we could do for this study was try to keep it consistent across the study. But yeah, unfortunately, we could not do any analysis, so we do not know exactly the content of the hay. But I would say, like, from a general perspective, it was kind of a regular hay. So yeah.
Sure. Actually, I have one question. I'm not sure if I missed this point, but then in yours, chapter 3, when you're comparing the two groups, you said that you
Yes.
have one group is feeding from the net, and
Yeah.
then the other one is kind of all the others. So
Yes.
do you think that your kind of control group is kind of more diverse in the sense that that's causing the variation, and that's why maybe you didn't see a difference?
Yes and no. Yes, obviously there was a big diversity. As you can see, sometimes it was like loose hay, sometimes it was different type of dispenser. But we also had quite a diversity for the haynet group also, because as you can see, some horses had some haynets that were on the floor, Some had some like big haynets or haynets that were suspending against trees. So for the height, it was kind of similar. Like we also looked at the impact of the height and mobility and so on. And for all of that, both groups were kind of similar because we had a big diversity in both groups, which of course reduces a bit our internal validity, but it also makes our result more generalizable to like the whole population, because that's how it is like on the field. People are using really lots of different slow feeders and lots of different dispensers. So that's why I really wanted to include all this diversity.
Sure, sure. Thanks. We're coming to an hour, and I don't see more questions from the audience. So Mahi's talk will be available on our YouTube channel later. So please join me, and thanks Mahi again for this very interesting study. And you really did a lot of work doing your PhD, and I think it's also applicable to even other species. You know, the method you're doing your research is really great. So our thanks everyone for joining, and our next webinar, our future webinar should be at this time, like 5 p.m. Central European time. And then we'll still be, I mean, usually we are on Monday, but then this time, yeah, for me, we change it to Tuesday, but yeah, it's well worth it. And then, so please follow our, the next events on our Slack or follow our Facebook page. So yeah, thank you, Mahi, so much. And then thanks everyone for your
Thank
questions.
you.
And I hope to see you, yeah, soon the next time. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you a lot.